This is the complete video with Dr. Colonel Reisner from the Austrian Armed Forces and Reisner Freimann, a Ukraine veteran, German combat engineer who fights in Ukraine since 2022. I previously had released parts of it, so here's the complete version. Note, the video was originally recorded on 25th November 2024. So Butya, what was for you a major surprise?
The inconsistent dynamic, I would say. So you have totally different changes of dynamic on a battlefield, even in situation where you consider which on terrain which would be favorable for massive tank pushes. There's like staggering, continuous infantry fighting over months or years. I personally think about Chassif, for example, where the dynamic stopped for a long, long time. So when I remember like the beginning of 23, I was there already in rifle range to the Russians, and they didn't use the momentum to push into the city for like over a year, and which when they had all the favorable situation on their side, but then you have in situation where you don't consider it still active fightings. For example, in the past, it was always told that in the winter it's pretty difficult over there, but which is not true. There's constant fight going on. The terrain is sometimes even more favorable for mobile operations in the winter than in other times of the year, and it's the dynamic is really shifting and it's unpredictable sometimes. This is for me mostly surprising in this war. And even in areas where you came already to complete stalemate, it's mostly there where the most thing happen, where's a constant work going on.
Can you elaborate on the last part? I'm a bit confused. So there was a stalemate reached, but still continuous fighting?
Yeah, there's in that areas. I think the most people have a view that there's like a trench and a minefield, and then it stops everything. But this situation has to be maintained. If it's not defended properly, it's constantly contested to check if there's a weak spot or not. There's like constant reconnaissance going on, constant drone fighting. It's like it's this what we call the daily grind going on. So it's like a static situation, but the intensity doesn't get lower.
So it's basically an operational stalemate, but on the tactical side, you have constant attrition and losses and fighting going on.
Yeah, may I jump in for a second? Well, this is exactly what I always call this war of attrition, what we see actually, which is fought in Ukraine. I guess every one of you know there's a very famous movie called Im Westen nichts Neues, and the title of this movie pretty much says that for the home front there was nothing really going on actually on the west front, but in reality there was a lot going on pretty much. There was a lot of artillery shelling, there was a lot of fighting, snipers and so on and so on. Yeah? And this is also the case in Ukraine. Yeah? And it's also related, first of all, because there is this so-called transparent battlefield. That means every side can see what the other side is doing. So there is no real staging anymore, and there is no real maneuver, as long as you cannot control this transparent battlefield by bringing down the drones. And that means there is a constant fight, but you still think that there is not much going on, which is not true, because as it was said completely right, there is these small skirmishes going on, there is these drones fighting against troops on the ground, there is reconnaissance going on, there is artillery shelling, rockets, mortar, and so on and so on. And this is what we see actually, that the war is grinding down more or less.
Yeah, especially the artillery shelling. So it's hard to imagine, especially for Western soldiers, the intensity and the amount of artillery shelling is going on. It's not only when I compare it to my times in other missions when I was in the German forces working with other Western forces, artillery was mostly called in only on to destroy or to put a certain target under pressure. It was mostly a one-time event in a certain time frame, but there's artillery shelling constantly going on, and it's not randomly. It's planned because as soon there are some quiet times on the zero line for one side or the other. This time will be used to either way to fortify better, to get some more resupplies, or to even organize your troops better. And it's like this constant harassment fire going on just to show the side that this is an area they can't use. It's not necessarily directly to destroy something or to interrupt something, but of course, yeah, it's to interrupt something, but on a longer time scale. So if you're on a zero line, it's like there's no minute without shelling. You hear somewhere every time something.
I just would like to refer to the old Soviet manuals of war fighting in the case of a hot Cold War. And as you know, and as we both know, some of these old manuals are still valid and also used by the Russians. So the Russians, for example, they know a tactic which is called to seize terrain by fire. That means constant fire on a certain terrain spot will make it possible to more or less make sure that the enemy will not attack, because this terrain feature is under constant fire of artillery shelling. And this is what you have actually described. But I want once again stress what you said. As someone who has served in Afghanistan and in the Sahel, our fear at that time was always improvised explosive devices. But there was no artillery used against the International Security Assistance Force, or later Resolute Support Mission when it was Afghanistan, or not even in Africa. And as you completely right pointed out, that was a real shock for a lot of Western soldiers who joined the International Legion when they saw actually what it means to be under constant shelling of even heavy artillery up to 152 millimeters rocket artillery, which has a devastating effect. And that was a shock. And the International Legion lost a lot of soldiers because they were absolutely shell-shocked, I would say, and returned back from Ukraine to their home countries and said, Jesus Christ, you cannot compare that with Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, can totally underline this. It's I actually saw that firsthand. And so for a lot of Western soldiers over there was not only the artillery a shock, but also the situation that you are in a weaker situation than your opponent. Because in all these coin operations in the past, Iraq or Afghanistan, you always had the upper hand, and the most guys weren't used to work under such pressure, got low supplies, have to improvise, and so on. A lot of guys just couldn't stand that and quit it at that point. It was completely unknown for them.
You were not on the receiving end, actually. Yeah? You were able to call in air support, helicopters, gunships, whatever it was necessary to fight against the Taliban or the anti-Iraqi forces, but that is not the case in Ukraine, actually. And this is why I once again want to stress that the first-person view drones were such a very interesting surprise, because it is really the weapon system which makes it possible for the Ukrainians, especially in the close battle, to still hold the Russians back, which I think is quite important. It's even more useful than anti-tank guided weapons and things like that. It's sad that when you look at the losses of tanks on the Russian side in Ukraine, then you can see that up to 35-40% are the result of first-person view drones. Only 2%, it's said, at the moment is related to losses by the use of anti-tank guided weapons. And the rest is pretty much especially mines. So you can see what kind of an impact that had, that still have more or less, and because of the fact that this is used in the close battle area, the Ukrainians still manage more or less to hold back the Russians, but as you know, they're creeping forward.
A good point, because I catch up directly there, because there's a good point, as you mentioned, that this call for fire, for example, in artillery, or call air support, is unusual. Not so usual like we had this in Western countries in coin operations. The FPVs have also another big aspect, in my opinion, why they are so efficient, because they are in more like a horizontal hierarchy. When you want to have an air support, when you have a call for fire from artillery, you need a higher ranking officer, like a company level, battalion level, or something like that. As a normal platoon leader, group leader, you're mostly not able to call such valid asset But if you got a drone team in your company, or even sometimes drone operators in your platoon or group, you are able to use this small scale air support directly, and that's make it way more efficient. So the time, how it's called, the time to target is the kill chain is way shorter. We saw this also a lot in smaller artillery systems, like in my opinion, the 82 millimeter mortar is the most dangerous artillery piece in Ukraine, because the kill chain is really short, and you can call it more frequently and also accurately than the larger guns.
Yeah. Also, I want to jump in here. By the way, that is no surprise, because if you look at the reports from the Second World War, you will see that mortars were the most feared weapon system at that time. Mortars of a different caliber, up to 120 millimeters. But one thing I would like to stress, and this is why it is important also to understand why resources are so important to have it available. So the first-person view drone is a perfect weapon for the close battle, up to a distance of, let's say, 5 kilometers, even further if you have a repeater drone, which works actually as a relay station. But the problem is you still need the artillery, because at the moment we see that the Ukrainians still are outnumbered when it comes to artillery shells compared to the Russians. And why is this important? Because the Russians can form, according to their manuals, again, those artillery groupings which are working against the Ukrainians. And you can't use the first-person view drone against these artillery groupings because the distance is too short, more or less. So this is why you need, on all different levels, the assets you actually have to be ready to fight against the enemy. And this is why at the moment it is so complicated for the Ukrainians, because they still hold back the Russians by using their first-person view drones, but they have no real answer when it comes to artillery fire. And the same goes with the gliding bombs, because to fight against the gliding bombs you need air defense systems, medium and long-range systems, which make sure that these Russian fighters cannot drop their gliding bombs. So at the end of the day, and this is the problem actually, you need all the different capabilities to be successful. If you just only have the first-person view drones, which were a really, I would even say, eye-opening aspect of this war, it's great to have them ready, but it's not sufficient, because you need other stuff too and other capabilities.
Yeah, classic combined arms case. So it's just it's not the final solution, but it says it's another tool in the box. The glide bombs are actually one of the most biggest problems, in my opinion, right now. They have such a huge range and such an impact. I saw once one landing, and it was actually the most people don't know how terrifying airstrikes can be. It's the amount of explosive which is dropped at one time. It's impressive.
And just imagine there are loads up to 3,000 kilograms per gliding bomb, and that has a devastating effect on a typical strong point, like of a platoon or even of a company.
Yeah. So what I saw, it was mostly the problem is I saw some airstrikes before, but in an airstrike you have mostly like indicators coming beforehand. Jets are extremely loud. The most attacks by airstrikes I saw was in the nighttime, and when you see a jet through the night vision goggles, you see them of dozens of kilometers. It's insanely bright. So you have some indicators and can guess where they travel to and which are the danger areas. But on the glide bombs, you have absolutely no indicators. It comes pure out of the blank, and then it hit hard. And when I saw it was like, especially in villages or cities held by Ukrainians, like strong points, when they saw the effort would be way too big to take this strong point by mechanized units or infantry or so on, they just wipe out from the distance via glide bombs. This point, and they can actually choose the hardest.
Yeah. I can give you a good example where we were able to see these tactics, and this was Ugledar, because Ugledar was a very well defended strong point, who repelled 4 brigade-size attacks last year, but after 1.5 years of bombing with glide bombs, with rocket artillery, with artillery, it was pretty much done. So the only chance the Ukrainians had is to withdraw from the formerly well-defended strongpoint, because there was not much left actually from the strongpoint. And this is what the Russians do actually. They just shape more or less certain strong points in a way that you will not be able to defend them any longer, because they run simply havoc on them.
One point when we already speak about long distance firepower, which is often not mentioned, is how often the Russians use recon by fire. I saw the difference of this tactic throughout the years now. It's already years. And at the beginning of the war, when there was a lot still mobile warfare, they often used their mechanized assets like the BTRs, BMPs, and tanks. And for example, if you have a wood block, a little forest where they suspect Ukrainian troops, and they just drove up into the firing range and unload like a whole magazine or a few rounds of the tank and looked for a reaction, like does come fire back or so on. And then they decide, do we push further in with infantry, or we level that area just with artillery if fire comes back. Now we have a transition from that, so the tactic is still in use, but it's not so much more anymore with vehicle-based firepower, but more like with artillery in combination with drones. So often they observe the artillery fire and just lay some harassment fire by the artillery on this on a certain spot, and assess the footage later for the reaction, like are there wounded transported, or get the support or other units pushed in this area to defend it more, and they it's an active used method of reconnaissance.
Yeah. And it's even very often used actually to trigger a reaction. For example, if you see that there is some kind of a staging, by using the fire to just try to push the responsible commander to attack immediately, for example, not to wait until he has all the resources he needs available. I would like to give you another example, which is also interesting, which I have already pointed out several times. You see the tactics of the Russians using motorcycles, for example, to attack against Ukrainian positions. And as someone who spent quite some time looking through the Russian Telegram channels and so on, you can even see how they discuss this tactic. But also here it's related to the Second World War, because in the Second World War they had a formation called the Motorcycle Reconnaissance Battalion and Motorcycle Reconnaissance Regiment. Let's say a Motorcycle Reconnaissance Battalion had as a core element one tank company, at that time a T-34-85 at the end of the war, and up to 150 motorcycles, most of them Harley Davidson, by the way. And what did they do actually? They tried to reconnoiter more or less the German positions and to find these little gaps by using the motorcycles. And if there was a gap discovered, then they used as a first element this tank company to widen this gap, and then this motorcycle battalion was more or less followed by, let's say, heavier, stronger elements like mechanized brigades or motorized brigades. And this is what they also see today, for example. They even sometimes use smoke grenades, which they actually put on the motorcycle, and then with a drone they watch and see how far all the different motorcycles are able to penetrate into the Ukrainian lines. And the one which is the furthest one, this is the place where they actually then later on attacked by using these small elements of 1 or 2 tanks, 1 or 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and they conduct what they call the tank carousel, more or less. So to bring infantry to the spot, let them dismount, and have, again, a little bit of terrain occupied from the Ukrainians, which is more and more problematic for the Ukrainians because they're running out of troops. As you know, most of the units are down to 40-50%, so that means the trenches are only half full, and this is becoming more and more problematic.
So far, I recognize this issue. It has actually some similarities to this so-called human wave tactics. So they try to use the speed and agility to get as fast as possible close to the Ukrainian lines, and often they don't push directly with a full strength, so that the first element that sometimes trigger the fire from heavy weapons like mortars, machine guns, etc. So they can locate these heavy weapons and can directly destroy them. And if there's no fort back, they have to immediately push right into there pretty deeply. This was actually also seen in some city fights when the Russian used these human wave tactics, which was often called out to be inhumane and unnecessary from the Russian side. But it is, of course, but it has a certain logic to it because
Right, yeah, right.
if you have a break-in, you have a break-in like a full platoon or company strength at once. So it's not a small unit who breaks in. You have like a huge issue if this unit comes through. So it's very calculated if it's worth it.
Yeah. How do you assess the situation along the front lines? Because what I have said, the problem is that the Ukrainians are struggling to get people up to the front lines, and the ones I'm talking to, especially to the south of Pokrovsk, the thing is they're pretty much running out of people actually, because the trenches are only down to 40-50%, and that means there are some gaps. The Russians are able to find these gaps. They don't care about the losses, and then they break through, and they have another 1 kilometer which they have occupied, and then the next wave is coming, and so on and so on. And this is very very frustrating for the Ukrainians. Yeah.
To be honest, it's also not so clearly. So it depends completely on which unit we're talking about. So there are some units who are really good stocked by manpower, but actually has really not good material supplies like vehicles, heavy weapons, and so on. So sometimes you have enough people, but you struggle to get these to the zero line because you can't bring them without armor protection of an IMV, IFV, APC, or something like this. Like if you don't have it, you can't use this power you got. And also, if you don't have the firepower, you can't outgun the opposite side, and you have sooner or later to come to push back, pull back. I mean, and this is the biggest issue. There are definitely some units who have lack of manpower, but they sometimes have better equipment. So it's not really homogeneous situation.
I would even say that they try to make sure that they have some what we called what was called in the Second World War fire brigades, pretty much. So well-equipped brigade-size units, especially mechanized brigades, which are sent all over, like the 47th Mech Brigade is pretty much present all over the front line because it's acting as some kind of a first responder. And this is what the Russians try to make sure that the Ukrainians are not able to build up new operational or even strategic reserves, more or less. May I ask one question, which is also overlooked very often, and this is tactical combat casualty care. So, as you also served in foreign missions, and I did, so we were very proud of this very famous golden hour. So it was said that whenever you were hit by an IED, 60 minutes later there will be a surgeon working on you, and everything will be fine. But this is not the case in Ukraine. So if you're wounded in the morning, you very likely they will not be able to evacuate you because of the drones above you. Your chances are better in the night, and if you finally get to a surgeon, very often you will face amputations, traumatic amputations, because it's the only possibility to save your life. If you're hit somewhere in the abdomen, this is pretty much like a death sentence because no one can help you pretty much. And this is one of the things which are very often, I think, overlooked, especially now when you have this transparent battlefield.
I want to catch up 2 points right now. So first about the fire brigades you mentioned. So they are also on a certain level switch the tactics. So what I want to also to say in general is like when I hear especially from Western armies, they anticipate now lessons from Ukraine. I'm often thinking from when and where.
Yeah, right.
So the tactics and everything is changing rapidly. So you can't use the same tactics you used like 3-4 months ago today. And so one example is what you mentioned with these fire brigades. Of course, everyone knows the 47s. They get tossed everywhere where it's necessary, but even on a smaller scale. When I was still in a direct action team of our units, it was like a little, I would frame it like a light infantry special forces group. We still tried to do missions in a no man area or no man's land or beyond. And everyone in this time, in the first or even in the first half of the second year of the war, tried to do this. But it's not possible anymore so much because of the ever ongoing surveillance. And what you do now is like you have these small scale fire brigades where you have like a regular unit which looks from the outside pretty weak in their positions, like a regular TDF unit, like this reserve units, this territorial defense units, and the Russians maybe have their reconnaissance over weeks on them. And when they actually do a push, there's out of nothing not this unit anymore in the trenches, but like a specialized unit. So this use of small units or specialized units also changed a little bit. It's more like a game against a reconnaissance versus reconnaissance and intel. Yeah. And also about the tactical casualty care. This is actually a really bitter point because I wrote about this also a few times. This golden hour is like, if you're a really lucky guy, it's like 4 hours. Yeah, this is the shortest time frame I ever saw. One of my teammates had one exfil after 11 hours. He has already high temperature and shock situation and getting septic and so on. But I know from other units who has a lack of armored vehicles for casualty evacuation that they have like sometimes time frames up to 4 days. So the field medic, what they have to use and what they have to bring with them is also completely changing. Right now we looking for blood heater systems to prevent hypothermia in the field, and blood transfusion systems in the field, stuff like this, which you never have guessed you should do this in a field, because it's more like a World 1, World 2 measurement.
Yeah. But you still have to say that I would say that the Ukrainian side has the better tactical combat casualty care capabilities than the Russian side. Yeah? If you sometimes watch the videos from Russian casualty collection points, yeah, and if you look at the status of these soldiers, then you can see pretty much that no one took care about them. They were just dying there with horrible wounds, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a matter of triage. There was also some, I would say, more bitter days, especially among the larger battles. I can remember about some CCPs in Crimea, for example, during offensives, where the field hospital, the World 1, World 2, which was there, already run out completely out of medication and has to pull back to old school amputations and stuff like that. This is sometimes a matter, especially in larger operations.
Yeah. Like it was also last year during the Ukrainian summer offensive, especially at the beginning when they were trapped in these minefields. Yeah. Also here, because you said you fought in the Kremina forest. I talked to one guy who fought also in Kremina forest. Quite interesting, because I'm sure you both have seen Band of Brothers. You know, during the Ardennes offensive, when they are trapped some very around Bastogne, this city, and one of the most feared weapons from the Germans were mortar shells, which were actually detonating in the trees above them. So they were pretty much, all the shrapnel rained down pretty much, and I hear the same actually from Kremina, which is also here we see similarities from forgotten wars, which are still valid today.
I wasn't long in Crimea. I was more like in the city areas or in the village fights. But forested areas are rare Mostly it's only a few woodlines. Cremina is one of the areas where you have actually dense forests, so it's a completely different style of warfare there. Yeah, but mortars who explode in trees is an actual threat. So my first helmet got destroyed by that. But there I have to say that's again which I already mentioned. It's like one of the most feared weapons is a simple 82 mortar. Even when I hear some 120s coming in, it's mostly like a little relief because the 120 is mostly aimed to a bigger target, and the 120 is not so easy to adjust. So if they don't hit, they have you have a longer time to change your position before the follow-up shot comes. The 82s are way faster this way.
A question here. I think you mentioned it's mentioned in the book Invest Nichts Neues that they could hear that the artillery is coming in, and you mentioned that your trainers told you in the army that this was not true, but then you told me you actually can hear this when the artillery shell is zeroing in more or less on you. Is this the same with mortar shells as well, that you can hear when they are basically coming directly down on you or not?
Yeah, definitely. So that was actually it's an interesting anecdote. When I was in the German army, all our trainers said this whistling sounds of artillery and so on. It's not true. It's just a Hollywood rumor, but it's actually true. And mortars don't make a whistling sound like artillery. It's like hard to tell. It's like it sounds a little bit like a paper dragon. If you guys these little kites. Yeah, exactly. They sounds like kites in the air, which are get tossed to the air pretty fast, but they are flying pretty slowly, and you can anticipate where they are shooting at. If you sit there for a half hour, you learn it pretty quick to see to hear and determination where this will is fired from and where it will land. So I spent a few days in an area where I was constantly overshot, and yeah, after a while you get pretty relaxed because you know they don't shoot at you.
Would you say that they systematically work down a certain area? Because as you know, if you fire mortar shells, you just adjust a little bit more or less the coordinates every time, and then the next shell goes a little bit to the east from the last, and so on and so on. Would you say it's like that, or will they just constant shelling by using the same coordinates?
It depends on what the task of the unit is. So they use it also for like area bombardment, like this harassment or reconnaissance
Yeah.
fire, as I said before. But if you have an professional team, they often directly have their own drones and coordinate the fire with drones. So I was for a few weeks, months, it was maybe 2 months. I was replacement as at a mortar team for the Gunner 2 position because there was one guy lacking, and we got insanely fast. We had our own drone, and we had like first hit after 3 rounds in under 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's more like it was even a mortar from the 50s. So it was more like the enhancement of the capabilities you never had guessed in that weapon.
Mm-hmm. What's your experience when it comes to electronic warfare means, actually? Because it's my understanding that the Russians already have saturated the whole front line with those different capabilities which they have available. They not only affect very capable weapon systems like the HIMARS, so the GMLRS rocket, or the JDAM-ER, so the Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range, or even the Excalibur shell, for example. But how is it on the lowest level? Is there still the possibility to communicate to each other, or do you actually use runners to get the message through? What was your experience on that?
That was actually a huge problem, and it's so much present on a large scale that you have to adjust to it, and you wouldn't have guessed that. They have certain systems where they can block out every signal in a dozen-kilometer radius. The really large systems, I don't know how they call it. They look like a 40 feet container. with dozens of antennas. We call them a grill because they grill every frequency in a certain radius. But then we have also specialized jamming in different areas. The most regular target is, of course, the drones. We lost a lot of drones to EW, to certain aspects of spoofing also. So we received in the beginning of 23 a batch of highly praised Western drones, which I better don't mention here right now.
I know what you're talking about. They were already not that kind of successful in Afghanistan, and it was even worse now in Ukraine, actually. Yeah, I know the type. Yeah, actually, there are two of them. Yeah.
And we lost almost everything of them, every one of them, because they had the Russians found out to spoof them pretty fast, and it was like we used them for maybe 20 minutes, and then they can't. It was every time like we got a certain signal like they had a wrong input, like the system was thinking they are on 9,999 meters, so they corrected with full speed downwards, crashing themselves. It was actually pretty frequent. With the communication, it's not such a big problem, but like with the drones, but mostly probably because everything is focused at the drones. The communication is often still free because both sides use often the same systems. But also, the communication is mostly completely jammed directly before or during an attack, an ongoing attack.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have the old school system implemented, like it gets reported from every position what happens on the other position. So if you're in a command post and make your assessment about the area, you get different reports. So even if you don't hear from one position, you get input from other units who see this position, and you can estimate what's going on there. So that's one of the regular ways how we got around it. But of course, it's an extra step of work. It delays a lot of command capabilities. So it's still affecting to a certain degree everything.
Understood. Yeah. One question to the first person view drones. I mean, we are flooded by videos from both sides showing the really spectacular effects of these drones. But as you know, you only see the successful videos. Yeah? So you very much, I think, have 10 to 15 flights a day, and then you have two, maybe one is recorded, and that's what you actually put on social media. Yeah? So from your experience, when we take an average drone team, let's say average training, resources medium, so that means enough available, but no real pressure behind it. What would you say? So how many flights do you need in a certain sector of the front to get successful? Is it 15 to 1, 10 to 1, 5 to 1, or what do you say?
So normally a good team, a good equipped team, use depends on the situation, on the mission, between 20 and 60 drones per day. And of course, it depends on the target and the payload, etc. But we say mostly it's like it depends a little bit between 4 and 5 to 1. So you need like 4 drones to have one hit. If this hit is actually working, it's great, yeah, but you lost 1 or 2 to EW, maybe one got shut down, another one it's just crashed because if in a first person view drone you don't see much, and if you fly through a wooden area you don't see smaller branches or something like this where your rotors get already entangled. So a lot of countermeasures and of course accidents, but 5 to 1, I would say it's like a fair guess.
What's about the wild drones, which you can now see since 1 or 2 months more and more often from both sides? Would you say that we can see this all over the front lines, or is it, let's say, in the main directions, let's say south of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are using it? What would you say on that?
First of all, both sides using it.
I would even say the Ukrainians that was an Ukrainian idea, which was copied later by the Russians, is my understanding.
Yeah, probably could be that way because the Russians have more possibilities economy-wise to adapt faster to such situations. But the problems I have with the cable command drones is they have often seen in the media like the new topic and absolutely hot stuff right now, but it's just another tool in the box. You have a lot of problems with these drones, so you can't use them so accurate and versatile like the regular FPV drones. But they have the huge advantage that they can fly in EW contested environments. So we regularly use them only to knock out the EW, and then enabling the other FPVs to use this gap of EW in this area to exploit it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes absolutely sense. Yeah. Would you say that the range is limited to the range of the let's say of the cable? I mean, when you look at some of the videos, you pretty much can see that they are going in a horizontal level, just going through the trees and so on and so on. I mean, I cannot imagine that this will go on for several kilometers. I say maybe 1 or 2 clicks and that's it. Or what's your experience on that?
So on paper you have actually a pretty good range. Some of these fiber optic cables are like 10 kilometers long, but the problem is you can't fly through too much complicated maneuvers or complicated areas like if you have like forest areas or overhead cable stuff, and then you got already problems because you got easily entangled. It's like the same problems you had on the old ATGMs like Milan, where you have the guidance cable. If you get it entangled in some bushes or branches or so, it can easily get ripped off or get wrong communication. That's the same problem with the fiber optic drones. So you can't do so complicated maneuvers like flying into the house through a few rooms to reach your target. You definitely can't do this. But you can get a target over a certain distance, not necessarily a straight line, but to a certain degree also in some wood lines, but not nearly as much like the regular FPVs.
Yeah.
Big thank you to Dr. Colonel Reisner and Budja Freimann for this talk. Thank you for watching and see you next time.